here to present their findings, or their recommendations related to the findings that they shared out with us last month. I will also share with this committee and whoever is with us, we had the opportunity to view the findings this week as an administrative team, and we're excited now that you're going to have the same opportunity. So the committee, I am representing the committee chair, Vanessa Woods, who is with us, but I guess en route here, but asked that we get this started. So welcome again, everyone. I know that Dr. Joftis has screen sharing. And Dr. Joftis, good to have you with us. And thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Appreciate it. And hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. We are excited to present the final recommendations of the equity review that we conducted for Bensalem Township School District. And Dr. Lee, just a quick thank you to you and your administrative team. As we mentioned the other day when we previewed this with your team, we're just extremely appreciative of all the hard work that you and the team have done, both to run the school system during a unprecedented time through the pandemic, but on top of that, then also giving us your time and energy, sharing information and insights that enabled us to complete this. We also want to thank Vanessa Woods, the chair of this committee, and the rest of the school board for inviting us to do this work. It's such critical work. It is not always easy to hear. And it's certainly not easy to address, but we respect the willingness to go through what can be a very, very challenging process. And we hope that you take the findings and recommendations with the intent that they're given, which is through lens of wanting to be helpful. And address some of the concerns that have been raised. So with no further ado, I am just going to go through a quick reminder of our charge, which was to conduct an equity review of the district. As you may remember, we presented the findings a few weeks ago. We were asked to look across 6 domains: outcomes, leadership, academics and access, finance, human capital, and family and community engagement. We did present those findings in full. Tonight, we will be going through very quickly some high-level findings just to help remind everybody and put context around the recommendations that we'll be offering. Again, just a quick reminder that the review took a couple of months this spring. We analyzed existing data of all kinds, interviewed a number of school leaders and district leaders and staff, conducted a number of focus groups with a variety of stakeholders. And then we also surveyed educators and school leaders or principals to come up with the findings and recommendations that you'll see here. So today, as I said, we're going to just be summarizing at a very high level. I'll be summarizing the findings, and then I'll be turning it over to my colleague Iris Bond-Gill to go over the final recommendations that we're offering. We have a placeholder here with the X's just because the report will be widely distributed. We're not quite sure yet what the web page is or other means of getting it just yet, but that we know that will be made available. Dr. Lee, did you want to chime in there? Were you raising your hand?
Yeah, thank you. Clearly, we have had access to the report. The full board has had it for over a week now, and upon adjournment tonight, we'll share out with this committee through the chair, and maybe she wants to add when she gets situated. And then we'll have a special place on our website for not only this, but everything related to the committee's work moving forward, including the resources that were discussed a few months ago in this forum. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. And again, thank you for that. I think we just think it's so important that this be made available. We're really pleased that you agree with that, because we really feel like it represents the views and input of a lot of people, and who will want to see the more detailed findings and recommendations. Thank you for that. So just before we jump into the findings and the recommendations, I wanted to just quickly go over the way we approach this work. So we really looked at the district using two frameworks. The first one is what's called the Systemic Coherence Framework. That's work that's been developed at Harvard University, their graduate schools of education and business, working jointly together in a project called the Education Leadership Project, Public Education Leadership Project. And there, the idea is, in order to achieve equity and overall improvement for all students, we need to achieve what's called coherence, which is really just a fancy way of saying alignment with a clear strategy for improvement. And we know that equity is very hard to achieve without that, because without coherence, what happens is there's a lot of, I've called random acts of education, and it's hard to address the concerns of various stakeholders in a systemic way without the coherence. The second framework that we used to examine the district is our own 4 points framework for policies and practices that promote equity and racial justice. We developed this about a year and a half ago. We use it in many of our equity reviews and all of our reviews more generally. We've laid out the 5 key objectives here. There's a little bit more detail that is on the full framework, and that's on our webpage, and we're happy to share that with anyone who's interested. But we think that there are these 5 areas that schools and districts can use to promote equity and racial justice for their students and staff. Oh, I should mention that in our final report, the detailed report, we followed the domains, the 6 domains that I mentioned, in presenting both our findings and our recommendations. In the presentation that we're delivering to you tonight, we're presenting 10 overarching findings. So we're kind of cutting across just to try to summarize some of the main ideas for you without going into too much detail, because that would take a long time. It's a 90-something page report. And then we're going to be presenting the recommendations aligned with these 5 objectives in our framework. So rather than presenting the recommendations domain by domain, we'll be presenting them under the 5 categories in our framework for promoting equity and racial justice. So just to begin, I want to present to you our findings. Again, there's much more detail. We're not able to cover everything in the short time we have together. We're happy to answer questions later. But our first finding was related to the context in which this work was happening, which is during a unprecedented pandemic, worldwide pandemic. And our initial finding is just acknowledging the fact that this work is hard, it's challenging. The district has worked extremely hard and successfully to continue education for students, to make things as seamless as possible, given the goings back and forth between virtual and hybrid and the rest. So kudos to the district in addressing a very, very challenging situation there. Our second big finding that we're presenting this evening is that looking even at achievement rates prior to the pandemic, achievement and graduation rates are lower than the state average, and there's significant gaps both between schools and among different student groups. So that's racial, it's income, it's by disability. That's not unusual. Most districts in the country show similar types of gaps, but it's important to point out, and it's especially important to point out when schools are showing varying levels of achievement with similar student populations, because it means that we could probably be learning from one another, from other schools within our own district, and have some gains that way. The third finding is worth spending an entire hour on, but we'll just spend a couple minutes on it right now, which is that the district has as a goal in its comprehensive plan equity as a goal. What we found, though, is that the district really focuses more on equality as opposed to equity. And part of the focus on equality can be seen in the color blindness, and that's in quotes, colorblind approach to serving students. And this is a really well-intentioned thing to do, right? Like, we want to be able to treat everybody equally. But what happens in reality in education and other settings is that when we take a colorblind approach and when we treat students and schools equally as opposed to equitably, what happens is we're not acknowledging the challenges and strengths of different populations. And so by taking a more equity-focused approach, which entails differing resources, differing approaches based on the needs and strengths of students and schools and educators, we find that you can create a much more positive environment for all students, and certainly for those students who too often get left behind by our schools. Number 4 is we spent a lot of time in the report going through this. I'll try to be as concise as possible. But one of the things that the committee asked us to look at was the curriculum, with the idea that ensuring that the curriculum is addressing the history, the culture, the contributions of a wide range of demographic groups. At the same time, we often look at the extent to which that curriculum is implemented across the schools. So what we found was that that there is actually a sound curriculum and curriculum review process in place across the district. That is not to say that there aren't areas where improvement can be had. We detail many of those in the report. But we do find that overall, there are a lot of resources, and the curriculum addresses a wide range of perspectives that is appropriate. And the challenge for us now is to make sure, how do we make sure that that curriculum is implemented in a way that all students have access to it? In other words, that teachers are using that curriculum to give equal opportunity or equitable opportunity to students to learn the material that is defined by the curriculum. And then the challenge with that goes to our next point, which is not only is the curriculum being implemented to varying degrees by school and even by classroom, but many students are being, many student groups are underrepresented in some of our most rigorous courses, whether that's gifted education, whether it's honors courses or AP courses. And at the same time, Black students in particular are being suspended at higher rates than other students. So our students of color are both being denied opportunities to access the highest rigor of courses, and many students, Black students in particular, are being suspended and losing the opportunity to develop the content and skills so that they can have access to those courses. I do want to point out, as the administrative team told us, that this district works extremely hard to not expel students. And I think my recollection is correct that no students have been suspended over the last couple of years, and that the district works really hard to apply state policy evenly for suspension. So in other words, there are certain things that students must be suspended for. If a student brings a weapon to school, for example, there's no question that that student needs to be suspended by state law. That being said, the rates of Black students being suspended is twice as high as other students. And while we didn't look into this in a lot of detail, we do think it's worth paying attention to that and digging deeper into that for the reasons for that in the future. Similarly, the special education rate in Bensalem is very high. It's about 1.5 times the national average, and it's higher than the Pennsylvania state average. It's not 1.5 times as high for the state, but it is high. And so, again, in our recommendations, you'll see that we didn't dig into all the reasons for that. We do speculate on some things in the report, but we do think that this bears further attention and study, understanding why so many students in Bensalem are being identified with special education, especially in the categories of emotional disturbance and specific learning disability, which the district applies, again, about twice as high as the national average. The 7th recommendation has to do with the central office of the district, the administration, administrative team. We heard we got a lot of feedback from a whole range of stakeholders that there's really a need to reestablish the trust and improve communication between the central office and the schools on the one hand, and the central office and the community and families on the other hand. So again, we'll have some recommendations there. We detail the specifics of that in the report, but there was a lot of feedback about the need to really create this customer service orientation for the central office, both oriented towards the schools. How can we help you educate the students that you're serving, and to our families and communities? How can we best serve you and your children that come to the school? Now, I do want to emphasize that everyone we spoke to agreed that all educators, all administrators are incredibly dedicated to serving kids and families of all kinds. We're not saying that's not the case. What this is saying is we need to create systems and structures so that it's not reliant on any particular individual to do that, but rather that it's a systemic approach to that work. Number 8 is around the teacher, what's called the teacher bid process or the teacher transfer process. And as concisely as I can put this, is the district has negotiated with the teachers union a process by which when a teacher announces his or her retirement or leaving of the school district, there's a lot of movement within the district. So existing Bensalem teachers have 2 different opportunities to transfer to open positions. Now, that's great. We want to give our own teachers the opportunity to find the schools and the placements that are best suited to them, but it creates a number of problems that I won't go into a lot of detail around. One of which is it severely delays the district's ability to recruit teachers from outside the district. And by doing that, 2 things happen. One is it's much harder to recruit teachers of color, and we have as a goal, our whole district has as a goal, increasing the diversity of our teaching staff. That's very hard to do when you're 2 months or so behind neighboring districts in terms of being able to recruit teachers of color. And 2, and very related to that, is the top teachers, the teachers with the most opportunities, and that's many, and that includes teachers of color and other teachers, are also going to be snapped up very early in the process. So we're losing our top talent by delaying our recruitment and hiring of teachers as a result of the transfer process that the district has negotiated. Number 9 is related to, I touched on this a little bit with regards to the central office needing to improve its communication and trust with families and communities. There's right now not a strategy at the district level for how to do that. So there's a lot of work that's done by the central office to reach out to community members and family members. But again, what we're looking for is a coherent strategy and systems for doing that. We also know that schools at the individual level have Title I plans and other plans and efforts devoted to engaging families. But again, what we're looking for is a systemic approach. How do we want to engage families? How do we want to welcome newcomers from outside of this country or from outside of the district, or any family that's beginning at the district? And we want to create a comprehensive approach to engaging families and making sure that we're meeting their needs and wants from a delivery standpoint. And then there's also a limited capacity at the central office to implement a strategy, even if there was one. In other words, there's no senior district administrator whose role it is to oversee, coordinate, implement a strategy devoted to family and community engagements. And so you'll see that in our recommendations as well. Last but not least, and certainly related to the family and community engagement strategy, is this notion around a community school approach. So for those of you who are not educators, a community school approach is one in which schools bring together a set of services and mindsets to serve their student and family population. So in other words, in addition to providing educational services during the day, obviously, community schools will often offer after-school tutoring programming for students as well as families, and become sort of a hub of the community with regards to providing health services, social services, coordinating entertainment, family events, and really bringing to families and community together in a way that can uplift the community and provide a more supportive environment for students to thrive in. We think in particular, the 2 schools that serve the greatest concentrations of low-income students in the district, and that's Faust and Rush Elementary Schools, would benefit greatly from an approach like this. They are 2 of the schools that where achievement levels are really lagging behind other districts. And again, that's not surprising, but it's something that we really think is important to address. So that's it. And those are the findings at a very high level. I'm going to pass it now to my colleague, Iris Bond-Gill, to walk you through our recommendations.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Thank you again for inviting us back here this evening. Scott just walked through some of the primary findings from the equity review. And so now I'm going to walk through some of the recommendations that we have. And as he mentioned, these are aligned to the objectives from the framework. So to start, and again, there are some additional recommendations contained in the final report, which you all will see or have already seen. But these are some of the ones that we wanted to highlight tonight and have an opportunity to respond to and discuss if there are any questions. So the recommendations under Objective 1. This objective is to ensure that students of color have access to high quality schools. Under this objective are the following recommendations. One is to revise central office's structure, and we have presented in recommended org chart to separate school leadership and curriculum and to create a leadership position related to equity and family and community engagement. A clear management approach and theory of action should certainly guide the restructuring And we provided, again, this draft organizational chart, which we believe will get closer to where we need to be. I'll just highlight a couple of those changes. One, it separates the curriculum and instruction function from the school coaching and school supervision while bringing federal programs under curriculum and instruction. It shifts some capacity currently residing with curriculum instruction into that school improvement and coaching unit. It adds a cabinet level position focused on equity, family, and community engagement. And they also would hold the data and accountability related to equity and improvement goals to be able to monitor and improve performance across the divisions. So both the school leadership and principal supervisor, that role, as well as the equity and family engagement positions would be direct reports to the superintendent, which we think are really critical. And in particular, the equity and family engagement position would need to be that level, because that would, again, be a position that you would want to be able to look across all divisions and really monitor those performance goals with regard to equity, the equity targets that are set. Additionally, we have some recommendations about improving trust and communications. There were several findings around, challenges there with communications, and certainly challenges also with trust, both trust within central office, trust between central office and schools, and some trust between, the school district and the community and parents in terms of where the school would respond to issues that may arise, particularly issues that are sensitive related to racial issues, social justice issues, and issues of equity. So we talked about engaging principals regularly and authentically in district decisions. We know that every decision, particularly those that are highly confidential around HR, those types of decisions certainly can involve everyone, but to the extent possible, ensuring that you have the right people in the room and folks who are closest to the work that actually understand the problems and solutions does create much more trust and transparency in the work being done. And also fostering a customer service approach from central office that focuses on the community and especially on minoritized and marginalized families. And that includes families that have language barriers as well. And then the third is to, I don't see it there. Ensure resources to schools are based on the needs of the student population. And so one of the very strong recommendations, among others, is to ensure that there's some sort of a weighted student funding formula. This is, again, moving away from an equality lens and moving toward an equity lens, so that students who are, we often say, coming to school with the most barriers are actually getting the most when they get here, most and additional resources. And so that is, again, doesn't sound like everyone's equal necessarily. It doesn't sound necessarily flat, but it is really ensuring that those who come with the most needs are also getting the most. And so it is an equity position. And quite frankly, one that this is a highly important critical lever for the school district, and one that the school district could look to move on more quickly in terms of priorities. The second set of recommendations are under Objective 2 to eliminate racist and ineffective policies and practices related to student behavior and discipline and program placement. And so a couple of things to highlight here. Scott already mentioned the disparities in gifted education. So we did recommend a number of strategies to reduce those disparities, including using additional data points for identifying gifted students, in addition to, but certainly beyond, the IQ test, and removing requirements for students to be identified as gifted to access advanced courses in mathematics. And there are some additional ones as well. Develop and then train on a behavior policy that is focused on closing the large gaps in the discipline rates between white students and non-white students, particularly Black students that Scott mentioned earlier. This is particularly the case with discipline referrals and suspensions. And as noted, the district has very limited expulsions, which is a very positive position, and we applaud you for. And we know that some schools are doing work to look to lower the discipline referrals and suspensions. However, the work is being done through an equality lens. Really, how do we look across and lower them all? And we would encourage that the district also be very laser focused and targeted on how do we reduce the disparities in Black discipline rates, because without that, you can risk lowering them all and still having an outsized number of students being disciplined that are, as we see now, that are Black students. The next is to provide training. So staff training, and as stated in the board resolution, it's critical that if the district is to move to become an anti-racist organization, there's work to do, not just in the policies, certainly work there, and that's much of what we're talking about here, but also in developing a deep self-awareness and new practices. And so this requires training to develop new and shared understandings of what this work needs to look like. It's ongoing and it's long-term, but it's work that we think is critically important to moving in the right direction and being able to implement all of these strategies at a high level. And then finally, celebrate students' diverse cultures, backgrounds, and interests and identities. And one of the recommendations in doing so is to really ensure that there are diverse voices and perspectives at the table when decisions are being made about those kinds of things in the schools and at the district level. We know that if we surround ourselves with people who all come from the same places as ourselves or look like us, that we will have blind spots. So to better mitigate that, having representation of the full diversity of the Bensalem community that we know you all are so proud of. We heard that over and over again from every group that we talk to. Ensuring that that is representative at the table when decisions are made is critical to the work of ensuring that we're celebrating and responding to students in ways that make them feel seen. The third is objective 3, to ensure that students of color, low-income students, and English learners have access to highly effective educators. So Scott did talk some about this, but we have recommendations around building the instructional leadership capacity of principals, investing in principal professional learning and professional learning communities that build their skills and mindsets so that they can also be equity champions. And really have a lens for equity as they're reviewing and seeing instruction and seeing those kinds of practices and features. Next, a number of recommendations sort of hinge on human capital changes to improve the diversity within the district. And that's racial diversity, ethnic diversity, language diversity. And we know and hard to fill positions as well, I should say that. We know that these are challenges faced by districts across the country. So this is not at all easy, but we have some ideas that we have seen work in other districts that we wanted to make sure to share with you and highlight. So one is during the next teacher contract negotiations, 2 changes that we think are really critically important is to increase the number of PD days, professional development days, for and time for teacher collaboration. So what is in Bensalem right now is lower than what we would want to see. It's lower than sort of the national best practices around how much time to give for training and to give for teachers to really work together on their practice. So we would recommend increasing that. And the second, revising the transfer process to enable the earlier hiring of candidates, as Scott alluded to. The next is to work to, and again, these are not easy, but we think that these could be really effective strategies, increase staff diversity by targeting where you're recruiting. So for instance, building relationships with minority serving institutions, investing in grow your own pathways. And that includes both identifying paraprofessionals who may be interested in moving into positions as teachers and thinking about how to support them. So we recommend some ideas we've seen work in other school districts. For instance, a program in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where they do work with a Grow Your Own Pathways with partnerships with the local college there. And also prioritizing bilingual language skills for all open positions. And we say that these positions in schools because every position is really an opportunity to get someone new in the school and someone additional in the school that can support families and students who do not speak English as a first language. And so there are some schools that have a large population of, for instance, Spanish-speaking students, Spanish-speaking families, but very few people in the building who can translate. And so relying on students to translate and things like that may not be the most effective. And I do know that there are also some programs that are being used that have definitely been discussed, but those also have drawbacks when it comes to personal conversations that people are looking to have. It's always good to have someone in the building and multiple people, if possible, who can speak the language and make those connections, and culturally as well. We also talk about increasing the number of social workers, counselors, and ESL teachers, and then implementing professional learning on cultural competence. Again, here we want to stress the importance of training and building deep self-awareness and awareness of structural inequities as well. That takes time, and so it won't happen overnight, but we know that the district has that commitment in the board resolution and in the district's comprehensive plan that really talks about equity. And so we know that this is something that is shared there as well. Framework 4, objective 4, excuse me, is to ensure that all students have access to high quality curricula, instructional practices, and unbiased assessments. One area of real strength to leverage is related to STEM and career pathways. And so improving alignment of curriculum and programming and really using that to brand and market the district, we think is a real strength to build on. Additionally, we know that the district does have a number of non-negotiables that exist, and we are really acknowledging of the fact that the district has a real commitment to serving all kids. And we know that in addition to that, we are recommending that there be some additional non-negotiables that really focus on creating a welcoming, inclusive environment for students that will require language access and additional diversity as well. And that the non-negotiables, while serving all students is an absolute non-negotiable, that there be an additional focus on sort of moving away from the color blindness that Scott mentioned and moving toward a very clear articulation of equity as an approach that, that all schools would also implement. Update curriculum where appropriate to ensure inclusion, equity, social emotional learning, and usability for educators. Continue to ensure effective curriculum implementation through observations, analysis, and district guidance for equitable instructional practices. And so certainly the trainings would also encompass that, and then being able to know what to look for, which is also why we recommend investments in principal training as well, so that as instructional leaders, they're also looking at equitable instructional practices. Conduct an assessment of why we do have a high proportion or a high percentage of students identified with disabilities. It's just a flag, and we flag it because we see that number. And so it's something for the district to just take a look at further. And then plan to address students' potential learning loss and trauma related to the pandemic. So some concerted focus and effort on the social emotional skills, both in teachers, the trauma-informed practices, so that we're not re-traumatizing students when they enter the classrooms, and some additional support for learning loss, particularly in places where we already had large gaps. And the final recommendation, or the final objective and area for our recommendations, is under objective 5, make schools the center of communities. So under this recommendation, we have a number to just highlight here. Develop a community and family engagement plan at the district level and create that position that I talked about earlier, where it is a cabinet level position focused on community engagement, family engagement, and equity. Establish a vision for community schools with a focus on Rush and Faust. That should take each school's particular context, meaning the needs of the students and families and their goals and desires of the families and community, and ensure that there are resources and wraparound supports for those schools. That would also include language access and staff who speak second languages as well, to support families and to create an inclusive environment. deepen partnerships with community organizations already working with families and students. So we know that there are community-based organizations that already have trusting relationships with adults in the community and with families in the community. We had great opportunities to speak to community-based organizations in interviews and focus groups, as well as teachers and students across the board. And we know that there are those relationships that we believe deepening those connections to the schools would be very beneficial. And then the last two are really around some immediate changes that we would be interested in you all thinking about, which is creating maybe a welcome center to coordinate services for newcomers and for English learners in the district. And we've seen that done well in other places. And that's also detailed out further in the report. And then creating a superintendent's parent cabinet that really focuses on bringing in diverse parent voices. We know that there are active PTOs in schools, which is excellent, and that those PTO leaders have the ear of the superintendent. And we would also just recommend that PTOs are sometimes, as you all know, not the most diverse and representative of the school and the community body. And so it would be an affirmative approach to really bringing in families, voices, much like actually this diversity and inclusion committee of the board did. You all ensured that you have parents and community representatives and students that are diverse and across the board. And I think that is a very similar strategy that you could use for this parent cabinet, where they meet potentially quarterly or bi-monthly with the superintendent. They hear some of the ideas and decisions that are coming down. They get to have input. And so it's really a two-way engagement strategy. And so that's our final recommendation here. And I think that we will kick it back to Ms. Woods or Dr. Lee, and we're happy to take questions or discuss any parts further. Thank you.
Thank you both. And the chair is here.
Thank you both for that insightful presentation. I know that this work has not been the most easy. Bensalem is definitely a very special place, a very unique place, and I think that you both saw that in working with our community members. And so I'm really appreciative of the findings and our ability and willingness and desire to work on implementing some of the strategies and recommendations that you both have spoke about today. One of the things that I would also ask, and I'm sorry I didn't ask this before, is also if you both could provide recommendations also for this committee moving forward and what that might look like and how that might unfold. I think that that would be helpful because I want this to be as effective as it can. And because this is an extension of the district, I would also like recommendations for, how we move forward and how we proceed as well. So that would be greatly appreciated. But other than that, if anybody has any questions, I would like to open the floor up for that. Questions or comments?
I have a quick question. So I'm on the community diversity team, and I work in the community and the nonprofit space a lot. And right away, when you talked about creating like a welcome center, I just thought, there are so many programs that we have in Bensalem where we could coordinate with leadership and possibly bring them into our schools. I guess I'm just curious to hear what your experience with that in other districts has been. What sort of organizations would you recommend getting involved? And then what does that look like when it's implemented? where does it go? What does the facility look like? Who's involved in that process within the district? If you could just give me a little insight on that.
Sure, thank you. So as far as the Welcome Center goes, it actually doesn't require, I know it sounds this way, but it doesn't really require like a standalone center, right? It doesn't have to be a facility. It could be a staff person and whose job it is to who's accessible to the community, right? Like you don't want to bury somebody on the third floor somewhere, but it doesn't have to be like a fancy actual center. I think the role that we've seen this in is a place like Hartford, Connecticut, where they have a person there who is bilingual, who works with families, to your point, Ms. Benitez, to, as they're coming in, making sure that they know how to access various services, make sure that they are getting their vaccinations done in a timely way, that they're, enrolling their children in school appropriately. So it's really just helping navigate the system. And now to the point you made about the various nonprofit and other social serving organizations, that's another great role that person can sort of help, having a resource guide, and as families coming in, doing almost a it's needs assessment is the wrong term, but like a some kind of inventory as the family comes in, and being able to then direct them to services that are appropriate. I'm not sure you were asking, but I think also is related to that is the community school model, which is where you actually then bring some of those organizations, whether they're nonprofits, whether they're city or state agencies, to the schools, so that, and in particular schools that are serving especially high need populations, so that it's actually at the school site. So we don't want to just have it coordinated everything at through this one person or through this Welcome Center, but also to be able to create this kind of community school environment to help students and families get access to tutoring and other types of supports that are necessary or important.
So we have St. Mary's, YWCA, Bucks Opportunity Council. So those sorts of organizations, we would want to create a space for it, particularly looking at Rush and Faust, and have sort of a hub that they can help us to share their programs with our students and families.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, it's again being very strategic, right? So maybe in Rush, oh, sorry, we're getting some feedback there. There you go. Maybe in one of the schools, we based on an analysis, we find that there's really a need for additional after-school programming and summer school programming. So we want to then be strategic, like maybe that's the YWCA that you mentioned, and ask them what their capacity is to provide those particular services. We may also find in other communities, this was several years ago in Syracuse, we found that a lot of immigrants were coming to school during the winter without winter coats. And obviously Syracuse is very cold. So they partnered with a local organization so that there was like a clothes closet, so that students had access to warmer clothes during the winter time. We also have heard other schools where kids were not getting their clothes washed as frequently as needed. So the school actually brought in like a laundry facility and helped families have access to laundry facilities. So it really depends on the needs and wants, as Ira said, of the families in that school, and tailoring the types of services and opportunities that are most suited to them.
Michelle, I'm glad you brought up the Welcome Center. The minute I saw that, I don't know, everybody who's in the room, my eyes are lighting up. And it particularly, I think it's going to dovetail, somebody help me, was it business or personnel? I don't even remember. One of those meetings, we were talking about hiring a bilingual assistant. And that person, who I affectionately want to call the Senora Hotline staff, that would perfectly fit. And then Dr. Lee and I are sitting here, we were just talking about how in our schools, like, we do have some of those facilities, right? Some of our children who come in and they need clothes washed, things like that. So, once we get that additional bilingual asset, and I think it's just the mindset, right? Like, Michelle, you're talking about resources we have, right? The YWCA is already sitting right there at Bucks Meadow. I think it's a matter of focusing on and putting these resources together in a coherent fashion, and particularly with bilingual staff, so that everybody knows how to access it. And that bilingual person would be kind of under the community diversity and inclusion, community outreach supervisor anyway, and kind of bringing all that together. And there's an exciting role for the board and cabinet and everyone to help make that happen. And we probably have, Michelle and Dr. Lay, I think we probably have a little space. I mean, our elementaries might be a little tight, but if we really wanted some space, I suspect we have some at the high school. And then probably an office in each of our elementary schools. We must have a room somewhere to dedicate where social workers or whoever, could come in and liaison, don't we?
They have space, but it's in one particular school, even though they serve all of our schools.
So I guess we need to take a facilities look, particularly in Faust and Rush, and I don't know, figure out how to do this, but this is a lot of exciting, the Welcome Center, and I was really excited to hear about the parent cabinet. My brain's spinning over here. I'm thinking we morph, to Vanessa's question as well, right? Like, put the diversity committee members together with the PR committee members, and we could do some exciting things together. I think, it's all about making it your priority, right? Like, we will do this, and then it can get done. Wait, Alyssa's going to ask, when a teacher how to use the...
Oh, push. I just have a quick question as to, while I understand that the focus needs to be Rush and Faust, where the most resources need to be. I guess I'm wondering why the high school wouldn't be a priority as well. When you have these kids that have gone through all of these findings the longest, they've had the most trauma, they've been, you talked about the highest suspensions, you talked about how the lowest in the gifted programs, why the high school wouldn't be a primary focus when these children are going to be in the world very shortly.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I don't disagree with that at all.
I assume that finding was about as among the elementary schools. That's what I thought. Is that maybe that was, I should not have
It
assumed.
is, but I'm sorry, I don't know who was asking that question, but I think that's an excellent point. I mean, the high school, by just looking at, again, as an objective outside viewer, has some issues that it needs to address in terms of attendance. To your point about suspensions, a lot of those are happening at the high school level. Graduation rates aren't where we would like them to be, especially among certain student groups. So I would completely concur, and we probably should have made that more of an emphasis in our findings.
Okay, great, thank you.
Sure.
And I mean, we already, as a district, we already know that the high school needs significant attention. I mean, we got our wonderful 21st Century grant. We only got it because Schaefer and the high school have significant issues in those regards. So there is that pot of money that is specifically for the high school in Schaefer.
Good.
Which doesn't mean Snyder or anyone else needs to be left out. I didn't mean it that way.
Oh, right, of course.
Can I ask a question? Anybody else? Could you go back? Oh, on the high disability rates. I mean,
Yeah.
that's not news to any, at least the board members and the cabinet members. We're running, let me see, I think we're near 22% of our children have an IEP, which is
Right.
far higher. How would you said it's a flag. Is it a flag in general or a flag with regard to equity in particular? And what type of analysis and what recommendation, a little more specifically, would you make?
So, Iris, I'll take this, and then you should jump in if you have other ideas. But so it's not an equity issue in the sense that we see it in a lot of districts, which is that Latinx and Black students are referred to special education at significantly higher rates than white and Asian students. We didn't see that. It's called disproportionality. What we did see is that it's a very high level rate, and that the rate in particular, there's a whole number of disabilities that a student could get identified for, right? Like I could have a severe medical condition and I would be appropriately identified with an IEP so that I had the supports I needed to be successful. But what happens in a lot of districts is that students who are either discipline issues or have not been successful, perhaps because of instruction that wasn't as effective as it could have been, get identified inappropriately with a learning disability or an emotional disturbance in the case of like discipline issues. If the child is acting out a lot, some districts slap an emotional disturbance label on that child, put them in special education, and kind of get them out of the classroom. So we don't know that that's what's going on. We do know that both of those two disabilities, specific learning disability and emotional disturbance, are being identified at significantly higher rates than the national average. Those have been starting to come down a little bit with, I don't want to get too wonky here, but when the district began multi-tiered systems of support, which is an approach to provide supports to all students who are struggling to meet standards. I'll just kind of leave it at that as a description. That's meant to make sure that if students aren't being successful in the general instructional classroom, that they're getting additional supports before we refer them to special education. So the district has a pretty good approach to that. I mean, they have a very good approach to it, and it's being done mostly at the elementary school, and then as we see in other districts, it begins to sort of fall off at the middle school and especially at the high school level. So
are you saying then we need to increase MTSS and keep it consistent, not just in elementary, but middle and high school?
We absolutely need to do that. But we think that even before that, that the core instruction is what really needs to be looked at. So we talked about the fact that curriculum is not being implemented with fidelity, and so that we're getting pockets of excellent teaching and then pockets of teaching that may not be aligned with our assessments and our standards, and that can lead to does lead to very unequal outcomes. So when that happens, then that starts to trigger referrals to special education. So we didn't go into the level of detail in terms of studying that as an issue. We have some hypotheses. We think that if we implemented curriculum more effectively and created some of these wraparound services, that would take care of some of it. But we just think it bears further analysis. Iris, did you want to add anything to that? I feel like I'm not answering that as clearly as I could have.
I think you answered it pretty thoroughly.
Okay.
I understood it, and I'm not an educator.
Okay.
So there you go.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question? Because I have two more. I'll just go ahead. All right. When we last met, you had not yet completed conducting the focus groups. So I wanted to ask a little bit more. One of your major findings is there's a fair amount of distrust between the community and the schools. I'm assuming some of that came out of your focus groups. Could you elaborate a little bit more? I mean, that these may not be easy things to hear, but I think these are important things to hear. And maybe there are more of them in the written report, but if you could just talk a little bit.
Yeah, Iris, do you want to touch on that one?
Sure. And I think this came from focus groups and also from our survey, where we had, I think, about over 300 respondents to the survey that are educators and principals. So it came from a variety of sources. In terms of, and I mentioned this, in terms of trust, it's both trust between the central office and the schools. And so that, I think, came out of our surveys, and I'll let you, Scott, talk a little bit more about that if you don't mind. In terms of the public, and so we did, I think, between 12 and 15 focus groups, and talked to students, parents, all over the board, educators, and also did focus groups with just educators of color and students, and parents of color. And so I think we really were able to get at some nuances as well. And I agree, it's not always easy to hear those kinds of things when you hear distrust, but we started our focus groups by grounding ourselves in the board's resolution, so the anti-racist resolution, and really sort of reading through the resolution that said, be it resolved that, and there's a number of things that the board has said and that the school district is really committing to in that resolution. And so that is really that you will address and speak out against and really take an affirmative stance. And there was a lot of feelings that just doesn't necessarily happen, that there's not really a policy when things happen in the community or that impact the schools, particularly when it relates to sensitive issues of race or social justice, and those issues don't get addressed. So that's sort of a just distrust of like, is this really about addressing issues? Because we haven't seen that. And as a result of that, it feels very opaque and there's not much transparency to really understand why there's silence. And so that came up across the board. And I'll be honest, students to all the way up, like it's just everyone sort of touched on that in various ways. So we do talk in the report about creating a policy and being really thoughtful and consistent about how you address issues that are of concern to the community. And that's also not very easy to do, but something that will take some work. There's also issues when you think about staffing and just distrust about how positions get hired and who's hired in and whether there's nepotism or different things there. So sort of, as we think about staff diversity and increasing staff diversity, I think there is some distrust around, is there a commitment there? What would that look like? What are the changes around that? And then I think around just language and really having a commitment that says we are going to prioritize, as we said, ensuring that there's someone, and hopefully more than one, people in the building who really have a responsibility to engage families in authentic ways that speak their language, right? Because that also increases distrust. And it actually does the opposite. It increases trust if we can start to build those relationships with our families and with our communities and with the students. And things around celebrating students' diversity and identities. And, you hear, young people are just so interested in having hard conversations that we as adults don't want any part of, but they're ready to talk about, what's happening in the world and these kinds of things. And so, just more transparency in how and when those types of things happen, if that makes sense. Scott, I'll let you talk about the central office.
Yeah, I mean, unless there's more questions about it, I think you did a good job of covering that. I'm happy to answer if there's another question about that.
I was just going to wonder, would this committee be able, from the focus groups, I don't know how you compiled that information, but at some point in one of your reports, you had like specific quotes. I was understood what you were talking about kind of from, that was a little bit of a bird's eye view for me. For me, I understand it best when I hear, kind of specifics and what I think I know what you're getting at. But so like maybe with the teacher surveys, will we be able to get some quotes or something from the focus group so we can really get it and some examples? Because sometimes if you don't have a specific example, you may have no idea what someone's talking about. If you're new to equity, right? If you're new to these concepts, you're going to need to hear, oh, when this happened, the other person felt that way about it, even though I had no idea. Maybe I should have, but I didn't. You know what I mean? Something a little more hard, more nuts and bolts.
Yeah, I mean, so we don't compile a like focus group report in addition to the full report. We tried to integrate what we learned from the focus groups throughout the 90-something page report. We did do some pull quotes. We really work hard to keep anonymity so no one feels like they're being singled out or put on the spot or anything like that. But we're happy to talk further about those particulars. We think the report provides a lot of details. So we're happy to talk further about those things if it would be helpful.
Yeah, that would be great. Dr. Lee was just mentioning that, from the surveys, we have some polls. But for me, it's very important to hear what the students and the parents and the focus groups had to say as well. So yeah, we can talk about that another time. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, I got one more. Of course, I say that and I'll think of 10, but here we go. So I want to talk about the structuring. So I know that there's a recommendation for a cabinet level position for, I don't even know what the proper title would be, but let's just say a diversity officer, right? That's a term you hear a lot. And that's essentially what you're recommending. So that was talked about. And of course, like any district, you have to work with the budget you have and try to do the best. I'm going to ask directly, if the diversity officer were high level but not cabinet, but still had autonomy to look at all other, tiers or whatever, or branches of the organizational chart, if they weren't too far down the totem pole, as it were, do you think that would be viable? And I'm asking that because putting a supervisor level, that would be our term, I believe a supervisor, would also allow us to bring on, and we've already talked about it, a bilingual assistant community person from a budget perspective, and the two could go together. So I'll say I have been on this, but that was exciting to me. If you think, but I want to know, if you don't think that's going to cut it, if that really needs to be cabinet level, then let us know.
So I'm so pleased that you are wrestling with this, and you're wrestling with exactly the right thing. So obviously you got to do what is feasible, right? So that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I would say, though, is that districts across the country have been hiring, I'm going to use more general term, but like a chief of equity, right? So a cabinet level equity or diversity officer. The challenge has been in observing what other districts are doing, and there's some articles in Ed Week, which is kind of a big education newspaper / journal, is that what happens is these folks often, their role is poorly defined. And when you're working in a topic that is as sensitive and challenging to do, and that is not always a super clear role, right? Like if you don't have sort of specifics, like my role as equity officer is to get more kids more kids of color into gifted education, it can become sort of a nebulous role. And that can be exacerbated when that person also does not have a lot of positional authority. So what I would suggest to you is if you've got a person and you've got the resources for a person that is not at a cabinet level position, make sure that the person that they report to is giving them the juice to get what is a very difficult job done. I guess that would be the best way I would say it.
So a tight job description, very, very
Job
clearly laid
description
out
with
what their authority
the-
is, their scope,
Yeah.
and just lay it out, right? Like,
That's right.
Mr. or Ms. So-and-so has the authority to go poke around in special ed, even if that's not there, right? And go talk to the teachers, even if they're in
that's
a
exactly right.
different, okay. And then
And that the
if we're
re- and
tight
that
with
the
it,
rest
it
of
could
the-
work.
Yeah, and with that, the rest of the cabinet, not only is that written as their job description, but then the rest of the cabinet backs them up. And if there's a question from special education or wherever they're poking around, that the rest of the cabinet says, "Yep, that's what they're supposed to do," and they're going to come in my department tomorrow, or whatever it is. But we have to be committed as an entity to making sure that that person can get their job done.
And that really comes from the superintendent, right? Not to
It
put
does.
Sam on the spot, but if
No, it
Sam
does.
says, cabinet, Mr. or Ms. Diversity Officer is, gets to poke about, and we're going to pay attention, and I'm not going to cover for you. I'm not suggesting you do that. I'm just saying hypothetically, right? We don't even have
Right.
this person. But so if it comes from the top down, it should be okay. And if we're tight with scope and authority.
I think that's right.
I think that's a definite start. And one thing that I didn't say much of, but is also in the recommendations, is that as Scott said, in order for this position to really be successful, in addition to having the authority and a clearly defined scope, it's also going to require that the central office have some training as well. And so we talked about training when it comes to people in the school buildings. It is just as important, if not more important, that central office engage in some ongoing deep self-reflection, self-awareness, and real skill building around what it means to have an equity lens, so that they can be supportive of this work and understand why this work is so critical, right? And so we're thinking like a professional learning community, a community of practice, like something where you are doing, shared reading, shared resources, and really diving in, because at the end of the day, this will not be successful if mindsets are not supportive of it and are not really bought in to that person's success and to that role's success. So it's a both and.
And on June 2nd here in Ben Salem, we'll have the opportunity to hear from 2 sitting equity officers at neighboring districts related to their role, their function, and the types of things that they're engaged with.
And we're very excited. We have to start doing, speaking of PR, we got to start doing some good PR about this. Where's my flyer? Dr. Lee and I are meeting afterwards to develop a flyer.
Well, I think
aren't
we're going to finalize the agenda tomorrow, and then we'll push it out.
So, okay, but and in the report, and I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to go deep into the final one, timeline, right? So, for professional development, for principals, cabinet, central office, all of that, it seems to me like we start that this summer. If we really want to go to this, we start there, because the teachers we don't have, for example, in the buildings over the summer, but our administrative staff is working. So did you guys lay out a timeline? Is that, I don't know, shouldn't we be doing something this summer? What should we be doing this summer? How about that?
Yeah, no, I think, again, that's exactly the right question. Part of our scope of work in our contract is to support action planning across the district. And that, I think, also speaks, Ms. Woods, to your earlier comment about what should this committee be focused on. I think it's important to get clear about what our priorities are for this committee, for the board, and then also for various administrative teams. You really want to have the administrative staff and the board members involved in sort of setting priorities and timelines and action plans, and that's something that we can help facilitate.
think we had to reschedule the June meeting because it conflicts with our high school graduation.
Oh, so June 2nd is not the.
Oh, June
is
2nd
not
is
the date
great.
now?
No,
No,
that's.
our
the-
reg, I was just, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I should have pushed the button. I was saying, all right, so we need to really sit down with you guys and figure out some timelines and things like that. But Dr. Lee was remarking June 17th, which would be this committee's next meeting, is high school graduation. So we will
I
all
gotcha.
be otherwise engaged. So we'll just have to finesse. Why am I not talking? Because you've got a mask on, that's why.
We can coordinate with Ms. Woods and Dr. Lee to as well. So
I have a really quick question. We were talking about the specific job description for the, what did you call it? Equity officer or? Okay.
yeah,
So
Yeah.
would staff training be something that could be part of that job description as well? So there's some oversight there and there's sort of like a leadership role over the cabinet.
absolutely.
But would that make sense at I don't want to, I guess, a lower level as a supervisor?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that if it is a supervisor or not a cabinet level position, that person can coordinate and work with people, the appropriate people to get that done. Yeah. Iris.
So then if they are cabinet level, it would be appropriate. And if not, then coordinate with the appropriate people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We're currently working with Champaign, Illinois School District. And I think I told Dr. Lee this and maybe Ms. Woods as well, that we would really model the position on the position we just helped them create. And that person, as Iris mentioned in our recommendations, is responsible both for the sort of the family and community engagement piece. And then we worked with them on a strategic plan, and we view implementation of the strategic plan as an equity role, right? So her role is to really make sure that the strategic plan is getting implemented, that we're measuring our progress. She's going to be reporting to the board. So it creates a little bit more accountability around what do we mean by equity, and creates kind of a continuous improvement loop as well. And then she also coordinates the equity training. She oversees the equity training that's being developed. Can I just make one other point? I know we're focused on this equity role. I also want to emphasize the role of the school leadership position, right? So right now, the district has a curriculum and instruction office, and that office is responsible for both the development of the curriculum, but then also the support that goes out to the schools. And what we're recommending is we split that into two and have a curriculum office, and then the other office be focused on implementation support of the curriculum, and having those two separate departments. So that responsibility is actually a really significant one. I don't want to underplay that at all. It's working. It's supervising the principal, so there is an evaluative component to it. But even more importantly, it's coaching the principals and their leadership teams around again, I don't want to get too wonky on this, but basically the key elements of their school improvement plans. And so again, the idea is to really create this tight, continuous improvement cycle. And this role is really, really critical for that.
So that's from the flow chart you have, and everybody will be able to see this soon on page, I don't know, like 68 or something.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
Okay,
So
school.
I think it's the first box. I don't have it in front of me, but the
okay.
School leadership
and curriculum federal programs really need to be separate. And then
Yeah.
the original recommendation, and I don't know, Dr. Lee's sitting here, we're kind of chatting about it, but then the whole equity thing.
Yeah.
Are separate.
Yeah.
Just make a point and just want to just say, with the equity officer, hiring of an equity officer, what I notice is that districts around the country, when there's the new hot buzz of whatever it is that happens, there's a new position that's created. And oftentimes when that buzz goes down, that position will often be the first on the cutting block when there are any budget cuts that happen. And with the position like an equity officer position, I don't think that the district could afford to cut that position at any cost. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. I agree.
And to that point, so the equity officer is also in community engagement, right? Which could also be public relations, yes? Slightly
So-
different, but in trying to make,
Yeah,
if it were to be cabinet to make this all a little more economically feasible, does
Yeah.
public relations kind of fit in there, even though I know it's a little bit different concept?
It could. I think it could. But we're really thinking about it more from more of this like engagement where like what Ms. Benitez was talking about with, community schools, coordinating with various organizations, making sure that we've got wraparound services, that we're bringing in diverse voices. To Iris's point about the parent advisory council, this person could sort of help coordinate that and making sure that we're getting sort of underrepresented voices being part of that group. So it's a big job, and public relations and sort of media tends to be a different skill set. And I know you all have that already.
No, we
but
don't.
again-
No, we don't have that. That's why
okay.
reason I raised
apologize.
this.
I thought you did have that.
No, we do not.
Okay.
Although, we have a fabulous PR committee, but no, we do not.
Okay.
We
So
have
it tends to be a different skill set, right? Like someone who can really get into the community and bring in underrepresented voices and coordinate services and then doing the equity work not as opposed, but that tends to be many skill sets. But then another skill set is media and messaging and social media and all that stuff, which is also critically important. So it's something we'd have to think through a little bit in terms of how you structure it. Every district structure is a little different based on the reality of their staff and their budgets and all that stuff. And we're happy to think through that with you all.
And I did want, I'm sorry, we do have a confidential secretary who serves in communications, but we don't have a PR professional is what I meant.
Yeah, okay.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Dr. Joftis, Ms. Bongill, thank you very much for the presentation tonight.
Oh, forgive me. How do other districts, because this is about to come up at the next board meeting, I think. How have other districts supported their paraprofessionals to, you're talking about growing our own diverse staff. So would that include like giving them good assistance to take courses to get their
Yes.
teaching degrees?
Yeah, that's what they're doing. And Iris mentioned Milwaukee. That's what they're doing there. They give stipends. They have
Like
an
tuition
agreement
reimbursement
with-
or whatever?
Yeah.
Not
yeah.
just for teachers, but for some of our paraprofessionals as well.
No, right. So that they can get their bachelor's and teacher certificate.
Something
kind of
worthwhile,
like-
not just a little bit. Thank
Yes,
you.
and they
That's
do
coming
that
up,
in-
I think.
They do that in exchange for commitment to stay in the district for X number of years. Like there's variations on that, but
I just wanted to make sure that came out in tonight's meeting. Thank you.
Sure.
Anything else from anyone else? Okay. Thank you again for the presentation, the work. We will be in connection. Everybody stay tuned. June 2nd at 6 p.m. Yes. 6 p.m. will be our Equity Summit, and we are all looking forward to it.
And you're all welcome to be there in our auditorium. Yeah, our capacity restrictions will be lifted by then, and we can all be together for an incredible, worthwhile event. Yes?
So the community, teachers, everyone is invited, and we will be sending out information shortly.